It's time to paint some Imperial Fists. Hello, you're watching Squidmar Miniatures and I am Emil. Today we're going to paint some Space Marines, and in this case specifically Primaris Intercessor. About a year ago, Antonio Peña painted a warband for Golden Demon for Warhammer Fest Europe, and that warband is just amazing. You can look at it here. And I really wanted to try to replicate his style and the way he paints his warband, because it's just so freaking beautiful. So today we're going to see if we can match that style, see if we can get that really nice kind of warm yellow tone. A few weeks ago I did the first test of trying to paint some yellow. I had this old piece that I haven't used for anything that I got for free. And what I did is I pre-shaded it with magenta tone and then going up to white. When you then spray it with a yellow ink, you kind of get these nice orange brownish shades to it. So I thought it would be a fun thing to try and see if this technique also works in a small miniature. And yeah, let's just do this. I wasn't really happy with the contrast of the speeder, so I thought it would be a good idea to prime the miniature with some Army Painter red primer before I started adding in the magenta and the white to really get the dark brown in the crevices. I then started adding some Vallejo magenta, adding this to all of the miniature, but leaving the darkest parts red. I then started adding some whites into the magenta to just make it more of a bright pink, and then going up to almost white. But I didn't go all the way up to white, and I'll show you why in just a few seconds. I then added some white to my wet palette. I used a Schminke Titanium white. This white is awesome, but if you have a different brand, it works totally fine. And this is the magic step that really makes the armor look like an armor, sketching in the values of light in the volumes of the miniature. And this is not a tutorial on exactly where to place the highlights. Once again, if you're interested in seeing where I put them, just watch this video again and maybe check the photos on my Instagram page and you will be able to copy where I place the highlights. And the consistency of the white is sort of 50%. And what this means is that I can do 2 layers of the white to get to a full white on the miniature. And this gives me the possibility to go and make transitions from the bright pink white to the white without having these hard edges. And the parts where I've added 2 coats of this white, I have a full coverage. If you feel like you learned something from watching these videos, I have a Patreon campaign where you as a viewer can pitch in a few dollars to make sure that I can keep running this channel, covering all the costs that I have with gear and with rent and putting food on the table for my kids. So if you feel like you get something out of this, please consider going onto my Patreon page and do like all of these $10+ supporters already have done. But if you can't, it's totally fine. The videos will still be free, but anything you can pitch in, if it's $1, really helps. So thank you guys. So I finished highlighting the mini, and I think it's looking kind of good. So it's looking kind of dark in some places, and I'm a bit afraid that it might turn into like burnt umber rather than the red brown that I want to have. But I'm really excited about seeing where this goes. So let's just spray it with the yellow. Let's take it from there. Highlight, change things if we need to. I'm excited. I mixed some intense ink from Green Stuff World together with some Flash Gits yellow. And here I really messed up because I had too much of the Flash Gits yellow. So the paint wasn't translucent enough. It didn't let enough of the base paint through the yellow color that I sprayed with the airbrush. So in the dark parts, instead of getting this really vibrant brown reddish shadow, I got a kind of matte desaturated yellow. It also kind of killed some of the volumes that I sketched in, so I had to redo parts of it. I started by spraying some orange ink in the shadows to kind of add back to that fiery punch of the shadows. And this is how it looked after the airbrush layers. It looks decent, but it's not what we're looking for. So I added some browns and some yellows to the wet palette to kind of add back to the volumes. To start with, Scrag Brown, Mornfang Brown and Flash Gits Yellow. And some Trollslayer Orange. The first shadow was a mix between Trollslayer Orange and Scrag Brown. The second one was just a clean Scrag Brown. And for the third one I mixed some Trollslayer Orange with some Mornfang Brown. And with that I got a really nice brown shadowy tone. And because I covered some of the yellow with some of the orange ink when I airbrushed, I needed to add some of the yellow highlights back. So I just sketched with a clean Flashkits yellow back onto the miniature where the highlights would be. And on some parts where I didn't need like the brightest highlights, I mixed in some of the Troll Slayer orange into the yellow, and this way I got sort of like a medium highlight that could act sort of like a reflection from something very bright in the environment around the miniature. And these were my only steps to kind of add back the highlights to the miniature. So now I just needed to apply this to the rest of the miniature as well. As for the metallic parts, talking about the weapon and the belt buckle, I started by base painting all of these black. And the helmet was painted red as it's supposed to be. I highlighted the metal parts using 3 colors. I mixed some Stegadon scale green with some Vallejo Luftwaffe uniform World War II. It's just a blue-gray, so any blue-gray would probably work. I used this mix and then just added a bit more white as I got higher and higher on the highlight. The final highlight is maybe 80 or 90% white mixed with this mix of colors. And when painting super small details like this, is one of the few times when I add a drop of flow improver to the wet palette. Because when I want to paint non-metallic metal on his belt buckle, for example, I want to make sure that I get a nice flow of the brush when I add some of the highlights. I do this in a couple of steps, and as you see, it looks really good. Now I just need to add this to the rest of the miniature as well. And if you want to replicate this, a recommendation is to just go to my Instagram page once again and search for this miniature and just try to copy where I place the highlights. This is a good first step into understanding where highlights would be, where reflections would be from the sky and from the environment. But of course, in the future I'm going to teach you all the techniques and all the physics behind where the light would be placed when painting non-metallic metal. And to create the base, I use the same techniques as I often do when making these semi-simple bases. To create the rock he's standing on, we're using some pine bark, gluing that with some Army Painter's super glue. I then add some super glue and sprinkle some fine coconut fiber onto the base. I purchased mine at IKEA, but any brand works. And when this is done, I just prime the whole thing black. I start off by dry brushing the whole base with some pale flesh. I then stippled some wraith bone on the base using the same dry brush as I used before. I felt like the gray tone that we had by just dry brushing was a bit too bland, so we added some more colors. I then proceeded to wash it with some Seraphim Sepia, and we're getting close to our final steps. Now we're going to use some brown reddish pigments from Vallejo. And in all honesty, I would probably have preferred if this one was even a bit more on the red side, but this was what I had at home. And what I do, I just use a regular brush that's dry, no moist in it, and start stippling onto this before the wash had dried. This way the wash binds some of the pigments to the base. I then added a small bush from Gamer Grass, and it's finally time to glue the miniature on the base. And when I've glued the miniature to the base, I just make sure to stipple some of this dry pigment onto the miniature as well, because otherwise it will look like a clean thing on a muddy ground, and that's not natural. So we want some of that pigment to spill over to the miniature to really add to the feeling of him being in the environment. And I'm really happy with the end result. I almost always say that when I paint. That's because I kind of work with my minis until I get to a point where I'm happy. And I feel like I also kind of matched Antonio Peña's original quite well in this case. And the time it took to make this one, well, I think it was maybe 5 hours of paint, and I think if I wouldn't have added too much of the yellow into the airbrush, I think I would have been done in maybe 3 hours after all the details was painted. And then add maybe half an hour to the base building and to figuring out all of these things around that. And on my website squidmar.com I link all of the products that I use and all of the equipment I have while I'm painting. So if you want to check out any of the stuff that I have, please visit my website squidmar.com, and if you shop anything from there, also you will be giving me some kickback. So that's a good way of supporting this channel as well. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you had a bit of fun. Don't forget to like, subscribe, leave a comment if you have any questions.